Now here for 10.2, we're going to do rational exponents. So 64 to the 1/3, when we have it as a fraction, there's two ways how we can write this. We can write this as 64 to the 1 in the cube root, or we can write this as the cube root of 64 to the 1. Notice how 3 in both cases, it's a root, and the 1 in both cases is an exponent. Now in your homework, I think it's going to ask you specifically to do it when it does the root first. So in that case, it will be the second case. If I say do it dealing with the power first, that's the first case. All right, so I'm just going to look at the second case. The cube root of 64. A number that multiplied by itself 3 times gives me 64. That's 4. And 4 to the 1 is 4. Same thing with B. I'm going to do the square root of 100 to the 1. Notice how I split the 1 half. The square root of 100 is 10. And then 10 to the 1 is just 10. Notice how here, the 1/4, it is going to deal with the 256 only. It is not going to deal with the negative. And the reason why, because the negative, that 1/4 is next to the 256. If I wanted to deal with the negative, I would have put it inside parentheses, just like I did in example D. So once again, let me deal with this first. So I'm going to write this as the 4th root of 256 to the 1. So I'm thinking, all right, a number that multiplied by itself 4 times equals 256. That is 4. So I have 4 to the 1th, which is 4. Now, because of the negative sign on the outside, my answer will end up being -4. Looking at D, I'm looking at this as the 4th root of -256 to the 1th power. Now, my 4th is an even root. I cannot do even roots of negatives. So I'm just going to say not a real solution. Here I have the 5th root of -2 to the 1. The 5th root of -32, that's a -2. I have -2 to the 1, better known as -2. Same thing with a fraction. I'm basically going to see this as 1 to the 1/3 over 8 to the 1/3. I'm going to split it. So the top, I'm looking at the cube root of 1 to the 1 over the cube root of 8 to the 1. I know the cube root of 1 is 1, so that's 1 to the 1, better known as 1. At the bottom, the cube root of 8 is 2, and 2 to the 1 is 2. So my answer is 1/2. Looking at example A, I'm looking at this as the square root of 36 to the 3rd power. I'll even do a 2 on the square root. Notice how I split my 3 over 2. I know the square root of 36 is 6, so I have this as 6 to the 3rd, better known as 216. Here I have the square root of 125 to the 3rd. I mean the cube root to the 2nd. Okay, I know the cube root of 125 is 5. So I have this as 5 to the second, better known as 25. Once again, here the negative on C has nothing to do with the exponent. So my root will not have to deal with the negative. So let me write this as the square root of 4 to the fifth. I'll deal with the negative at the end. So I know the square root of 4 is 2 to the fifth. 2 to the fifth is 32. Now, because of the negative outside, my answer will end up being negative 32. Looking at D, let me do the square root of negative 27. The cube root of negative 27 to the 2. Okay, the cube root of negative 27 is negative 3. Negative 3 to the second power is just 9. Notice that my fraction, the top number, I'm putting it as an exponent. The bottom number, I'm putting it as a root. So if I'm looking at E, I'm going to do the square root of negative 100 to the third. I'm putting the negative inside the radical because of the parentheses. Now, I cannot do the square root. 2 is an even number. I cannot do the square root of a negative. So I'm just going to say not a real solution. Once again, from the fraction, the top is an exponent and the bottom is a root. Now, let me see this as a negative exponent. Now, when we're dealing with negatives, 16, I'm going to see it as 16 over 1. Now, the negative, all it's going to tell me is flip the fraction. So I have 1 over 16 to the 3 over 4. Notice I made it positive 3 over 4 now. So I have a 1 on the top. At the bottom, I have the fourth root of 16 to the third. I know the fourth root of 16 is 2. So I'm looking at this as 2 to the third, better known as 8. And the top, obviously, I have a 1. So my answer is 1 over 8. Same thing with B. I'm looking at this as a 25 over 1. Because of the negative sign on the exponent, I'm going to flip my fraction, 1 over 25, and I'm going to do 3 to the 2. So looking at the bottom of my fraction, I have the square root of 25 to the third. And the square root of 25 is 5, and 5 to the third is 125. On the top, I have a 1. Now, looking at example C, I'm going to flip this because of the negative sign. It's already a fraction. I'm going to flip this as 27 over 8, and each of them are going to have 2 to the third. So, for example, on the top, I'm looking at the cube root of 27 squared. At the bottom, I'm looking at the cube root of 8